I'm going to be speaking on the 7 signs of the end of the age. We've just come out of a month where we've been remembering in particular the persecuted church. And one of the signs I'm going to be looking at is persecution. So it's in line with what we've been looking at in the last month. And you'll recall that shortly before Jesus was crucified, he went into Jerusalem and he was ministering daily in the temple, often staying in Bethany, which is close to Jerusalem, and traveling there over the Mount of Olives. And one particular occasion when the disciples had been pointing out the beauty of the temple, and Jesus remarked that not one stone would be left standing upon another. Later on, when he's with Peter, James, John, and Andrew opposite the temple on the Mount of Olives, they ask him, "What will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age?" And Jesus responds by giving 7 points that I'm going to just go through briefly. What will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age? He first said that there'd be many false Christs. He spoke of wars and rumors of wars, spoke about famines, earthquakes in various places, pestilence in various places, and then persecution of believers. But after that, he said, see to it that you're not alarmed. Such things must happen, but the end is still to come. And then he goes on to say that the gospel will be preached in the whole world as a testimony to all nations, and then the end will come. So the last sign he gives there is the gospel being preached to the whole world. And he says of those first 6 signs that they're the beginning of birth pains. Now, if you know anything about birth pains, you'll know that what they do is they increase in intensity as the birth approaches. They start off at a certain interval, and that interval is reduced. So for those who argue, well, earthquakes, wars, famines, false Christs have been around for thousands of years, that's true. The intensity will increase. Jesus wasn't predicting something new. There had been wars even in his time, but they would increase in intensity. And so in verse 5, he says, many will come in my name, saying, I am the Christ. Remember, Christ is just the Greek word Christos for the Hebrew Mashiach, Messiah. Many will come saying, I'm the Messiah, I'm the Christ, I'm Jesus. And they will lead many astray. And so he spoke of the lead up to his coming again as being a period where there would be many false Christs and many false prophets. So what is the trend? And this is something that I touched on in my first book. We find an increase in intensity. If you look at the 18th century, there were 2 Messiah claimants. In the 19th century, there were 7. But since the start of the 20th century, there have been so far 39. And so our age is well described when there will be many false Christs, many false Messiahs. The increase in frequency. Just to give you one example, we have the guys like David Koresh as well. Jim Jones was another famous one during some of our lifetimes. He was a communist, and he was frustrated with the harassment that the communists received in the US. And so he decided the best way to practice Marxism was to infiltrate the church. And so when he witnessed a faith healing service at the Seventh-day Baptist Church, he noticed how many people were drawn and how much money they gave. And he thought this is a good way of achieving his goals of, raising money, even though he was a communist. And he started his own church and became the People's Temple Christian Church Full Gospel. He claimed to be the reincarnation of Jesus, Buddha, Akhenaten, Vladimir Lenin. Notice, because he's a communist, and Father Divine. And in 1973, he founded a communist community in Guyana, which they called Jonestown. And if you know anything about him, which I'm sure most of you do, in 1978, he infamously caused 913 of his followers to commit mass suicide by drinking poison, and then he shot himself afterwards. This was a man who claimed to be Jesus. Just to give you one more, we without our own claim to fame, we also have our own Jesus in South Africa. Moses Longwani from KwaZulu is currently claiming to be Jesus. On the E-News Channel Africa in 2013, he announced publicly that he was the black reincarnation of Jesus and that he's immortal. And in the TV interview, he said he was getting ready to perform miracles like curing the lame, the blind, and resurrecting the dead. I'm not too sure if he's done any of that in the last 7 years. But he uses his disciples' welfare payments to fund his compound in KwaZulu-Natal, and he recently married one of his young disciples in 2016. Many will come in my name. Then Jesus said, you will hear of wars and rumors of wars, but see to it that you're not alarmed. Such things must happen, but the end is still to come. And we see the same trend with the increase in intensity. Again, you could say, well, we've always had wars. That's true. But the 20th century had 2 world wars, the Korean War, the Vietnam War, multiple Arab-Israeli conflicts, the Iran-Iraq War, the first Gulf War. It was one of the most violent periods in human history. In fact, military conflict took place during every year in the 20th century. There were only short periods of time that the world was free of war. According to Associated Press, an estimated 191 million people lost their lives directly or indirectly as a result of conflict in the 20th century. And so, increase in intensity. I drew up a graph there. If you look at the data that's projected of people killed as a result of war, there's the 12th to 13th century, and as you go on, you can see the big jump since the 20th century of people who have died as a result of war. And World War I marked the entry of industrialized warfare, as well as what we call weapons of mass destruction, chemical and biological weapons. World War II was the most frantic period of weapons development in the history of humanity. We found that we had the most powerful weapon that's ever been invented in history, the atomic bomb. And even that, they've improved, if you want to call it, inverted commas on that since then, that you can kill even more people with hydrogen bombs and nuclear bombs. And we saw jet planes and radar, all these innovations and long-range rockets being developed. Man finding better ways of killing each other. We supposedly advanced and evolved, according to some people, and yet man has used his clever technology to find more efficient ways of killing others. And so the Second World War was the most destructive conflict in the history of the world. About 70 million total soldiers fought on behalf of the Allied or Axis countries, and there was an estimated total of 70 to 85 million people killed because there were a lot of civilians as well. About 3% of the world's population at the time killed. And if you think, well, we've learned our lesson, well, that's a graph I got from a site showing state-based conflicts from 1946. In other words, after the Second World War, there's a track up until 2016. Do you notice things getting better? I don't. Okay, it's particularly yellow there, which is, I think, internal conflict over there. Civil conflict. So that normally refers to country fighting against itself. Wars and rumors of wars. Then he said there will be famines. During the 20th century, an estimated 70 to 100 million people died from famines across the world, of whom over half died in China and 13 million in the USSR. A lot of those were brought on by the atheistic communist governments who wanted to force them to a particular system which people opposed, and many people died of famine as a result of that. The World Peace Foundation reported that from the 1870s to the 1970s, great famines killed an average, you can see, almost 1 million people a year. Now, initially in the 21st century, there was a reduction in deaths related to famine. But in 2017, the United Nations declared that famine had returned to Africa with about 20 million people at risk of death from starvation in the northern part of Nigeria, in South Sudan, in Yemen, and Somalia. Approximately 150,000 lives were lost in the 2011 Somali famine. And so, although the global numbers of people suffering from hunger has declined 31% since 2000, the food and nutrition situation in sub-Saharan Africa has worsened. There's been economic woes, there's been drought. Well, just this year we see the COVID pandemic, the pressure that it's put financially on many countries that were already battling. Extreme weather are reversing years of progress so that 237 million sub-Saharan Africans are chronically undernourished, more than in any region. In the whole of Africa, 257 million people are experiencing hunger, and that's 20% of the population, 1 in every 5. Some 815 million people in the world don't have enough food to lead a healthy, active life. And that's not because the world can't produce enough, by the way. That's because of unequal distribution of food. And sometimes when it is distributed to the areas it's needed through corruption, it doesn't get to the people who need it. So over 1 in 9 people on earth, almost 1 in every 15 children in developing countries dies before the age of 5, mostly from hunger-related causes. Imagine seeing your child die of hunger. 66 million children attend classes every day with hungry bellies. Millions more are stunted from childhood malnutrition. Nearly 40% of children in sub-Saharan Africa grow up stunted due to chronic malnutrition. And an estimated 250 million preschool children do not get enough vitamin A. Some 250,000 to 500,000 vitamin A deficient children become blind every year simply because they cannot get the nutrition that they need. There will be famines and earthquakes in various places. Number 4. Between 2004 and 2014, there were 18 earthquakes with magnitudes of 8 or more. That's a serious earthquake. When we were young, I think we had an earthquake of about 5 on the Richter scale in Welkom in the Free State. That was pretty scary. We had 1 block of flats that collapsed and everything started flying around the house. That was 5. I wouldn't like to be in a magnitude of 8 or more. But that is an increase of 265% over the average rate of the previous century, according to a report to the annual meeting of the Geological Society of America. Remember, Jesus said, birth pangs. So if you look at all earthquake magnitudes, the past 10 years are not unusual in terms of the rate of events. What is unusual is the intensity. The major earthquakes are increasing. Those 7.5 or higher, according to Thomas Lay, who is a professor of Earth and Planetary Sciences at the University of California in Santa Cruz. I am aware of the fact that a lot of global warming is used to the advantage of globalists with the agenda of working towards a one world government or something that resembles that. But there's no doubt that we are experiencing global warming. That is data that comes from NASA, which is pretty credible, I would say. And it illustrates the change in the global surface temperature relative to the 1951 to 1980 average temperatures. 19 of the 20 warmest years have all occurred since 2001, with the exception of 1998. And 2016 was the warmest on record. But there you can see the trend. The trend doesn't show going down, it's going up. We are experiencing global warming. And some scientists predict that earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, giant landslides, and tsunamis may be more frequent as a result of that. So remember, Jesus said earthquakes. But according to Professor Bill Maguire of University College in London, he told Reuters when the ice is lost, because the more warming you get, the more the ice caps melt, and you get more flooding of coastal cities. The Earth's crust bounces back up again, and that triggers earthquakes, which triggers submarine landslides, which cause tsunamis. I don't know if you've noticed there seemed to be an increase in tsunamis. When we were young, you didn't really hear of tidal waves. Thought it was just something that happened in fiction. But look at that graph there. That's the trend with tsunamis. Now, I've done a projection of the 21st century, because we've only had 20 years of it. But if you look at the rate, you'll see that in the 19th century, there were 13. In the 20th century, there were 33. So far in the 21st century, in the first 20 years, there have been 18. And that's 20% of the 21st century. So if you project that rate, That's the kind of graph you get. Tsunamis. Then he said there will be pestilences in various places. I think that's very topical, especially with most of you sitting here with your masks on. And I'm just looking at, again, the trend that we see since the 20th century. We've obviously had great pandemics in the past, the Black Plague and the Plague of Justinian, but we've seen unprecedented pandemics in the 20th century and subsequent to that. And there's a reason for that, and I'll tell you later on. Okay, Jesus obviously predicted it. But the sixth cholera pandemic, 1910 to 11, the death toll was 800,000. The Spanish flu was actually far worse than the one we were in now. You know that it infected 500 million people, about a third of the world's population. That was just after the First World War. It killed more people than the war. Okay, the death toll is estimated, and they vary quite greatly, but the lowest estimates of the death toll was 17 million. Some of the highest estimates are 50 million of people who died from the Spanish flu. That was just 100 years ago. The Asian flu, they have given the dates, 2 million. The Hong Kong flu pandemic, 1 million. Smallpox. You might not think that that's a problem anymore. Do you know that it killed up to 300 million people in the 20th century? And around 500 million people in the last 100 years of its existence? You might have thought that that's something that's gone, because it's not something we see too much of. As recently as 1967, there were 15 million cases a year. What about TB? It's a big problem in our country, very much linked as a comorbidity with AIDS as well. It killed approximately 100 million people in the 20th century. A total of 1.4 million people died from TB in 2019. 1.4 million people. The worst thing about TB is it's curable. And most people die because even when they have treatment, they start feeling a bit better and they stop the treatment. And then they build up an immunity to the treatment. The most recent pandemics included SARS, and that's not the SARS that, we might view as a pandemic in South Africa. That's severe acute respiratory syndrome. In 2003, caused 774 deaths. The swine flu, 200,000 deaths. The most widespread outbreak of Ebola virus in history from 2014 to 2016 caused 11,000 deaths in certain countries in Africa. MERS, which is Middle East Respiratory Syndrome, caused 850 deaths. What about HIV? According to the United Nations AIDS, globally around 38 million people were living with HIV in 2019. That's last year. An estimated 1.7 million individuals worldwide became newly infected last year. Since the start of the epidemic, 75.7 million people have been infected and 32.7 million people have died. And you know where the highest infection rate is in the world? In South Africa. South Africa and Zimbabwe. In 2018, we had 7.7 million people living with AIDS. It's 20%. That's 1 out of every 5 people. It's the highest in the world. Not only percentage-wise, even if you disregard the fact that the United States has got a population about 7 times greater than ours, we've got more people with HIV in South Africa than in the United States. 240,000 people were newly infected with HIV and 71,000 people died from AIDS-related diseases. And this is, by the way, is information that comes from the United Nations. So if people think it's not politically correct, well, it's from the UN. They say the risk of acquiring HIV is 30 times higher for sex workers, 29 times higher among people who inject drugs, 26 times higher among gay men and men who have sex with men, and it's 13 times higher for transgender people. That was the latest stats I could get from the United Nations. And TB is the leading cause of death among people who have AIDS, because remember, it destroys your immune system. You don't die from AIDS, but because you have no immune system, you die from other stuff. It's estimated that 44% of people living with HIV and TB are unaware of their co-infection and are therefore not receiving care and also therefore probably infecting others. And yes, something we're all familiar with. Since the beginning of 2020, we have the coronavirus pandemic. As I was preparing this, I had to keep updating these stats because they climb in every day. And so the most recent global stats I could get was the 1st of December 2020. So far, in just the space of a year, there have been 65.8 million coronavirus cases and 1.52 million deaths. But it's climbing every day, and there's no end in sight until we get some sort of vaccination. And we already are now starting to experience another wave, as you know, if you watch the news in the Eastern Cape. And so there's quite a nice graph showing different pandemics, particularly in the 20th century. You can see COVID's still quite a small one comparatively, especially if you're comparing it to the Spanish flu, but it's still going strong. Why have we had such a big increase? Well, the big increase is obviously because of globalization and urbanization. Past centuries, firstly, we had a lot of people living in the rural areas. The trend has been that people are now moving into the cities, and so the chances of getting infected there is much greater. The other one is globalization, because of the fact that we've got such increased travel, and people can just jump on a plane and fly from one side of the world to the other. We know that that's how we got corona. People visiting Italy brought it to us, and the next thing we had a pandemic here as well. With commercial international air travel, outbreaks of infectious diseases can jump from one city to another remote city on the other side of the world in under 36 hours. It's interesting too that Daniel actually predicted that in the end times there would be a great increase in knowledge and a great increase in travel. Well, it's recorded in Daniel. It was actually Gabriel speaking to him in Daniel 12 verse 4. He says to him, "You, Daniel, shut up the words and seal the book until the time of the end. Many shall run to and fro." It's talking about travel. "And knowledge shall increase." And we know we live in an age of unprecedented gains in knowledge and technology and travel. It was barely just over 100 years ago when the Wright brothers were battling to get something off the ground, and now we have people not only flying in jetliners, we've even sent rockets to the moon. Then persecution. Jesus said, "Then you will be handed over to be persecuted and put to death, and you will be hated by all nations because of me." David Barrett and Todd Johnson are used as references for the Encyclopedia Britannica and the World Almanac, so they're pretty credible. And they say that there were more Christians killed in the 20th century than in the previous 19 centuries before that. They estimate the total Christian martyrs to be 70 million, and in the 20th century, 45 million. The contribution there. Unfortunately, their stats, I think, ended in 2001, and I haven't seen anything updated since their very intensive research, but we've certainly not seen a drop-off in that. And according to their research, and this is over 20 centuries, Christians martyred at the hands of Hindus was 676,000. Buddhists, the peaceful Buddhists that we told about, 1.6 million Christians were killed by them. Quasi-religionists killed 2.7 million. We always remember the Catholics. They're not killing Christians anymore, fortunately, but they had their go during the Middle Ages, and they killed 5 million Protestants. The animists beat them, though, 7.4 million Christians. Muslims, they've killed 9 million. But even they aren't the top. Can you believe it? Atheists have killed 31.6 million. You tell us how enlightened they are. Mainly communist atheism, the main contributor to Christian deaths. After that, Muslims. Open Doors, we had them here last week. They compile a world watch list, which is very good, and they've done it for a number of years, where they list the 50 worst countries in regards to Christian persecution. There's the top 20 that I've listed there. North Korea, I think for years, has been number one, and that's a communist country. And there you can see the others. I've highlighted the ones in Africa there in red. Somalia being the top one. Just to tell you a bit about North Korea, it's an atheistic state. It's ranked number one since 2002 when they started the watch list. And it's extreme, the persecution there. Meeting other Christians to worship is nearly impossible unless it's done in complete secrecy. If they discover Christians, they're deported to labor camps. as political criminals or even killed on the spot. According to one report, and this I got from Wikipedia, at least 200,000 Christians have gone missing since 1953. Christians must keep their faith completely secret. If a Christian has a Bible or part of one, it will be carefully hidden and only read when the believer is sure they are alone. And this is the terrible thing, is many Christians cannot even tell their children about their faith because they've often used methods of getting information from children at school, showing them Bibles and asking them if there's one of these at home. And sometimes the children end up getting their parents arrested or killed unwittingly. And so they can't even tell their own children until they're older for fear they may let something slip. Yet behind the headlines, a massive underground church of 200 to 400,000 Christians is growing in North Korea. According to Christian Solidarity Worldwide, documented incidents against Christians that in North Korea include being hung on a cross over a fire, crushed under a steamroller, herded off bridges, this is in our enlightened world today, trampled underfoot, the report continues. A policy of guilt by association applies, meaning that the relatives of Christians are also detained, regardless of whether they share the Christian belief. And even North Koreans who escape to China are often repatriated by the Chinese government and they end up in a political prison camp. Second on the list is Afghanistan, which is an Islamic state by constitution. It doesn't permit, according to their constitution, any faith other than Islam. And if you convert to any other faith, it's tantamount to treason. And they actually, and this I got from Open Doors, they consider you to be insane if you convert. And so often Christians, when they're discovered, are put in psychiatric hospitals and obviously administered all sorts of drugs to try get them sane again. And they have their homes destroyed. And then I've just done the top three. The number 3 is Somalia, which is in Africa, third on the list. Christian communities under constant threat or attack. Persecution of Christians almost always involves violence. In many rural areas, Islamic militant groups like Al-Shabaab are the de facto rulers. Even though you've got a central government, it doesn't really amount to much. So you have these bandits ruling these areas. Christians who come from that Muslim background are seen as targets and often killed on the spot when discovered if they refuse to convert. In 2020, this is from Open Doors, 2,983 Christians were killed for faith-related reasons on average. That's 8 Christians every day. So if you feel pretty safe here, well, that's not typical of the rest of the world. 9,488 churches or Christian buildings were attacked. 3,711 Christians were detained without trial, arrested, sentenced, and imprisoned. 260 million Christians experienced high levels of persecution in those top 50 countries on the World Watch. That's a 6% increase from 2019. And the main drivers behind Christian persecution worldwide, well, as you could see, if you look at the top 20 list, one of them is Islamic extremism. That's the main driver in 33 of the top 50 countries. Dictatorial paranoia, 6 countries. Religious nationalism, like Buddhists and Hindus, 5 countries. Communist and post-communist oppression in 4 countries. Organized corruption, that's the driver in places like Colombia and Mexico. Even though there's a lot of Christians there, you often get groups who go and kidnap people and pastors and demand ransom. And if they don't get it, they kill them. That's just a picture showing the bloody aftermath of a massacre during Palm Sunday in 2017. When a suicide bomber murdered Christian worshippers in Alexandria in Egypt. That happens every year. I can tell you now, coming up to Christmas, there'll be, if you watch, particularly in Africa and the Middle East, there'll be Christian churches targeted, particularly in Christmas when I know there's a lot of people there and bombers who wreak havoc. Jesus said, we must expect persecution. John 15 verse 20, remember the word that I said to you, a servant is not greater than his master. If they persecuted me, they will also persecute you. If they kept my word, they will keep yours. And we're told in 2 Timothy 3 verse 12 that anyone who wants to live a godly life in Christ Jesus will be persecuted. It might not be as extreme as what we see in other countries, but we all will experience, if we are true believers, some sort of persecution. And according to Jesus' prophecy in Matthew 24, that the intensity will increase. It's not going to get better. He spoke about birth pangs as his second coming draws near. But persecution has actually often served to spread the church rather than destroy it. We saw that right in the beginning in the book of Acts. When the first persecution breaks out after Stephen's death, what happens is the church in Jerusalem is scattered, and it says that everywhere they went, they spread the gospel. And we know that there were 10 Roman emperors who tried to destroy the church. And in the 2nd century and the 3rd century, the church was undergoing massive persecution from the Romans. And Tertullian, who was a Christian, a converted lawyer, who actually was converted when he saw people die at the games, and he couldn't believe how the slave girls would die such a brave death. And he writes, "We are not a new philosophy, but a divine revelation. That's why you can't just exterminate us. The more you kill, the more we are. The blood of the martyrs," that's his famous saying, "is the seed of the church. And you frustrate your purpose, because those who see us die wonder why we do. For we die like the men you revere, not like slaves or criminals. And when they find out, they join us." So much so that by the 4th century, they had legalized Christianity, because the church had grown to such an extent that, it was getting to the point where it was no longer a minority religion. And we know in the beginning of the 4th century, Constantine legalized Christianity in the Roman Empire. We've seen the same, just one case in South Sudan. Despite extreme persecution from a fanatical Sharia Islamic regime, the Sudanese Christians increased from 1.6 million in 1980 to 11 million in 2010. That's in 30 years. And what has happened subsequent to that, because of the extreme persecution, eventually they had a referendum in which 98.83% of the people voted in favor of the split, because the South Sudan is the predominantly Christian part, because there was such intense persecution, and now it's an independent country. Since the 1949 takeover of the Communist Party of China, both Catholic and Protestant missionaries were expelled. They believed that Christianity was a manifestation of Western imperialism, and they got rid of the missionaries. And the church was worried, because they thought Christianity is going to die in China. But the fastest growing church in the world today is in China. That's after missionaries were expelled. 150 years of missionary work ended when 5,600 missionaries left. Westerners feared that the estimated 750,000 Christians would not survive the harsh rule and the persecution of the atheistic government, determined to exterminate believers. Yet 60 years later, the number of Christians had grown to an estimated 100 million. From less than a million, 100 million. With estimates of between 20,000 to 30,000 people a day being converted. It's the fastest growing church in the world, followed, by the way, by the church in Africa. So even though that's not the trend we see in the Western world, it's certainly the trend elsewhere. Now, as we often mention, when one part of the body suffers, we all suffer. Paul says in 1 Corinthians 12:26, we are a body, the church, the worldwide church. If one part suffers, every part suffers with it. If one part is honored, every part rejoices with it. Now you are the body of Christ, and each one of you is a part of it. Hebrews 13 verse 3 says we must continue to remember those in prison, and he's talking about those in prison for their faith, as if you were together with them in prison, and those who are mistreated, as if you yourselves were suffering. So our sufferings are pretty light. Yes, we are persecuted, maybe mocked, ridiculed, but certainly not what we see in the rest of the world. And so what can we do to support the persecuted church? Well, we can pray. And in order to pray meaningfully, it's good to keep aware of the issues. So it's good to subscribe to organizations like Open Doors and Voice of the Martyrs and, the different ones that exist, so that you can pray meaningfully instead of just praying generically. God bless all the Christians in China. It's a lot more, meaningful to God help Mr. Wong who's in prison for his faith. We can give to agencies that help the persecuted church, which we as a church do, and some people do privately on top of that as well, and encourage. We can either correspond with, and where possible, visit or assist. But then the seventh thing Jesus said, the final one, is this gospel of the kingdom will be preached in the whole world as a testimony to all nations, and then the end will come. We're living in the end days. Jesus has given us these signs. We've seen the increase in intensity in the earthquakes, the famines, the wars. And he said that when we see those things, it's not yet the end, but the end is coming. The birth is coming. According to Joshua Project's website in 2015, most recent stats I could get from them, 65 million people hear the gospel for the first time every year. 178,000 hear the good news each day. And in the last 12 months, at that time, there were 50,000 new churches started in a year. 50,000. Evangelical Christianity is growing faster than Islam, and twice as fast than Buddhism and Hinduism. There we can see the rates over there, the growth rates annually. According to Wikipedia, Christianity, those who subscribe to Christianity are 2.4 billion. Now, obviously, we know that includes a lot of people who are nominal Christians and what we call none of the above Christians. When they get a census form, they say, well, I'm not an atheist and I'm not a Muslim, I must be a Christian. Let's take that one. Okay, we acknowledge that, but there are 2.4 billion people who call themselves Christians, 1.8 billion who call themselves Muslims, 1.2 billion Hindus, and 500 million Buddhists, four major religious groups. Christianity is the largest religion in the world. Approximately 1/3 of the world's population claim, anyway, to be Christians. And this I got from data from David Barrett, and I just took it from the 14th century onwards. We can see the change in the trend. In the 14th century, 24% of the world was estimated to be Christian. We're at a point now where 33%. So that's an increase. You can see the scripture languages at that time was 30, and see the rapid increase in the 20th century, obviously as a result of computerization. It's greatly facilitated, translating languages. Evangelization of the world, you can see in the 14th century sitting at 27%, sitting now at 72%. Jesus said this gospel will be preached in the whole world. And what you can notice there as well, interesting trend, in the 14th century, 75% of the church was white. Now it's only 41%. The whole tables have been turned there. The effectiveness of Protestant missions in the 19th and 20th century. And the most remarkable thing is the rapid growth in Africa and Asia. The center of gravity has shifted from the West, where the church was historically European, and then the New World with the Americas. It's now shifted, and we've seen the major growth, phenomenal growth. And that's why many people are surprised by these stats, because often people think, well, Christianity is in decline. It might appear to be so if you live in the West. But if you look there, in 1800, 99% of Christians were in Europe and North America. Now only, 2010, only 31%. And 69% now are in Latin America, Africa, and Asia. If you look in terms of continents, we can see in 1900, 68% of Christians came from Europe. Now it's only 28%. 1900, that's just over 100 years ago, only 2% of people in Africa were Christians, and that's changed to 18. In Asia, it's grown from 4 to 16. So where we've seen the growth, Latin America, 11 to 24, we've seen a major decline in Europe, having been 90% Western 100 years ago. Christianity is now 69% non-Western. There's been a decline of church attendance that's marked in the Western world. And the decline has mainly been in Europe. In North America, it hasn't really changed much, although I would argue that the quality of Christianity there is a lot worse than it was 100 years ago. People who claim to be Christians, but are nominal. And there, the stats over there of, according to cultural traditions. And again, I won't go through all of those. If you're interested, you can go download on the website, and you can see they've plotted all the major cultural traditions: African, Afro-American, Asian, European, 1900 compared to 2005, and you'll see this rapid shift. For the first time in centuries, non-European Christians exceed Christians of European origin. Asian Christians already outnumber North American plus Oceania Christians. Oceania is Australia, New Zealand, and surrounding areas. Jesus said this gospel will be preached in the whole world, and then the end will come. True Christianity has grown by more than 300 million believers in the last 10 years. You know, the shocking thing is only 3% of that comes from North America and Europe. Only 10 million. 290 million come from developing countries, which include Nigeria, Brazil, India, China. The church in the non-Western world is growing fast, while the church in the world is decreasing. The interesting thing is the growth has often been in the areas where the persecution of Christians is worse, is the worst. What did Tertullian say? The blood of the martyrs is the seed of the church. Often when people get comfortable and prosper materially, they forget about God. When they've got a lot of money in the bank, then suddenly God doesn't seem to be so important in their lives. Sadly. And so Jesus, we know, with the Great Commission, told us, he told his disciples, applies to us, go into all the world, preach the gospel to all creation. Whoever believes and is baptized will be saved, but whoever does not believe will be condemned. Jesus said in Matthew 24 that the gospel will be preached in the whole world as a testimony to all nations. He didn't say it will be preached in most of the world, in about 80%, and to most of the nations, and then the end will come, the whole world. So we still have a job to do, and that's what I want to close off with. Has the gospel of the kingdom been preached in the whole world? In 2007, David Barrett and Todd Johnson estimated that the number of unreached people, it was people who hadn't even been exposed to Christianity, was 1.8 billion people. And so there's a very approximate graph, just to round it off to nice numbers. If you take people who claim to be Christians, we've got 1/3 of the world. Let's say that only about 1/3 of those are actually true Christians and others are nominal. We've then got 10% dedicated Christians and maybe 20% who say they're Christian, but, not so much. That 40% there, they've heard the gospel, but they've rejected it. That's, something they will be judged on. They've heard, they've got no excuse. But that 30% have not rejected the gospel. They haven't rejected Jesus. They don't know who Jesus is. And that is an indictment on us, because we have been told to go into the whole world. And that's the 30%. Not so much the 40% that's already heard. Not so much the people who've heard the gospel again and again and again and have rejected it. We need to be targeting those who've never heard. Because Jesus didn't say go into most of the world, but all the world. Despite his command to us to evangelize, almost 1/3 of the world's population, 1 in 3 people, have never even heard of his name. Whose responsibility is that? That's our responsibility. And so we look forward to the return of Jesus. And as we see those signs happening, even though it's terrible things Jesus is talking about, pandemics and famines and wars, we are excited by the fact that it's a sign that Jesus is coming soon. But we also need to remember the 7th one. The gospel will be preached in all the world. We have unfinished work. And so when John in Revelation chapter 7 sees this great crowd standing before the throne of God, he said that it consisted of every nation, tribe, people, and language. He didn't say most nations and most languages, all. And so that's why I think it's wonderful where we see, how the church is now diversifying, and where it's been historically, situated a stronghold in Europe and, the New World, how it is now growing faster in Africa, Asia, and South America. That's what should be happening. The whole world needs to know. But I want to remind us as well that we have a duty not only to evangelize where we are, because that's also important. We need to be evangelists and we need to support missions. Evangelism is preaching the gospel where we are, and missions is preaching the gospel where it hasn't been heard. And so I want to leave that with you, the fact that we have this challenge. Even as we've come out of this month where we've remembered the persecuted church, we see it's a sign of Jesus coming, but so is the fact that the whole world needs to have the gospel preached.